He was found alive, curled inside a tape-shut box bought for $15 at a dusty garage sale. No label, no sound, no air holes. And weeks later, that same dog led the man who opened it to a buried tin of letters, a photograph from a forgotten summer, and the impossible truth that they had met once before, long ago, when fate had already begun writing their names side by side. This isn't just a story about a rescue. It's about memory with 4 legs, silence that guards, and a guardian who chose when to return. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what do you think was the dog really protecting? Marcus hadn't planned on stopping. Not that day, not on that street, and definitely not in front of a crooked folding table piled with secondhand mugs and sun-bleached paperbacks. The sky was a dull silver, the kind that makes colors feel muted, like the world had decided to speak in grayscale for a while. It matched his mood. Saturday mornings were supposed to mean pancakes and coffee, maybe music if he was lucky, but lately they just meant silence, and not the peaceful kind, the kind that hums in the corners and creeps into your bones. He parked out of instinct, not intention. One foot stepped out before he even processed what he was doing. Across the driveway, a woman in her 60s stirred her coffee with a plastic spoon, watching him with that look people give strangers at garage sales, half amusement, half suspicion. Marcus's eyes scanned the usual mess-old trophies, worn-out shoes, picture frames without pictures. Nothing spoke to him, but then, nothing really had in a while. That's when he saw it. Under the table, shoved between a rusted lamp and a cooler that had seen better decades, sat a box. It was taped up, half concealed by time and dirt. The thing practically whispered forgotten, and for some reason that made Marcus pause. He crouched, tilted his head. No label, no writing, just the heavy silence of something long ignored. "How much for the box?" he asked, almost as a joke. The woman shrugged. $15, belonged to my brother, I think, or maybe my dad. Been in the garage since before he passed. $15. He could have bought lunch, a new book, even filled half his tank. But Marcus pulled out a crumpled bill and handed it over without thinking. The woman didn't even look surprised, just took the money, sipped her coffee, and said, "Hope it don't bite?" He chuckled politely, though the air around the box suddenly felt heavier. Lifting it was awkward. It made a faint rustling noise, like something shifting inside. Marcus hesitated for a second, then brushed it off, placed it in the back seat and drove away. Back at his small, quiet house on Oak Ridge Lane, the box sat untouched in the foyer while Marcus reheated leftover soup and flipped through channels without watching. He didn't open it that night. Maybe he forgot, maybe he avoided it. Hard to say which. The next morning, a beam of sunlight stretched across the living room floor, landing right on the box. Dust shimmered in the light. It was oddly cinematic, like the universe had taken time to set the scene. Marcus sighed, grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and knelt. The tape gave way with a soft rip. He opened the top. The smell hit him first earthy, like old pine, and something faintly warm, like fur. His eyes adjusted to the dimness inside, and then they locked onto a pair of eyes staring back at him. Brown, deep, alert. Marcus flinched, instinctively recoiling a bit, but the creature didn't move. A dog. Not a puppy, full-grown German shepherd. Dark brown and black fur matted in places, but strong. Alive, very much alive. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just no water. Just a thick blanket and a silence that suddenly felt too deliberate. Reaching slowly, Marcus extended his hand. The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't retreat. He touched the fur, warm, real. A thin leather collar hung loosely around the dog's neck. The tag read, Atlas. Nothing else. No address. No number. Just that name. No shit. The dog in a sealed box. Who trusts fate that much? He stood, poured water into a bowl, and slid it toward the dog. Atlas sniffed it, then drank without breaking eye contact. Still watching. Always watching. The weight of it hit Marcus slowly. The past few years had felt like he was drifting, no anchor, no real connections. His marriage had ended with more silence than shouting. Friends had slowly faded, and his phone rarely rang. But now, in his living room was a living creature that seemed to carry stories in his bone. He tried offering food, a piece of cold turkey. Atlas sniffed it, blinked once, then turned away. Not interested. Marcus laughed. Suit yourself. That evening, he pulled out an old dog bed his ex had left behind, set it near the window. Atlas sniffed it, circled once, then laid down as if it had always been his spot. Night fell. Marcus sat on the couch, remote in hand, TV still off. Atlas lay quietly, tail twitching now and then. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was the closest thing to company he'd had in a long time. The first night felt like waiting for something to go wrong. Marcus sat on the couch, feet bare against the cold wooden floor, glancing over every few minutes at the dark shape curled by the window. Atlas didn't move much. He shifted his weight once, let out a low exhale, then stayed still for hours. It wasn't sleep exactly, more like rest in a way only creatures that have seen too much can manage. Marcus, on the other hand, couldn't quite sit still. Every creak in the walls made him glance toward the door. Every gust of wind outside made him think about the box. Why would someone leave a living dog sealed like that? Why didn't the dog bark? Why did he look so calm? These weren't just questions. They were suspicions trying to claw their way into belief. When midnight came and went, Marcus decided he had to try feeding him again. The dry kibble from an old box in the pantry had gone untouched. So had the canned stew. The bowl sat there full and sad like a rejected offering. Marcus stood in the kitchen with the fridge open, staring at a half-used pack of turkey. He pulled it out, unwrapped it, and without thinking too hard, tore a slice with his fingers, walked back to the living room, knelt down slowly. "All right, let's try this," he said softly. Atlas opened his eyes, not startled, just curious. Marcus held the piece of meat out, hand open, no tricks. Atlas sniffed, waited, then leaned forward and gently took the slice from his fingers. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then looked back up. No tail wag, no sounds, just... Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So you just needed a human touch, that it?" They didn't say anything else that night. While Marcus didn't, Atlas never had. But the silence between them was starting to shift. It wasn't empty now. It was shared. When Marcus got up to head to bed, he paused at the hallway. Atlas stood and followed a few paces behind, stopping short of the bedroom door. He didn't attempt to climb on the bed or even enter the room. Instead, he laid himself down right at the threshold, front paws crossed, eyes facing outward. Marcus watched from under the doorway. "You standing guard or something?" he asked. Atlas didn't respond, didn't need to. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Marcus didn't jolt awake at 3 a.m. There were no flashes of memory, no phantom arguments echoing from the walls, no mental spiral of everything that had been lost. Only sleep. Full, uninterrupted sleep. When he woke up, light was streaming through the window, and Atlas was still there, unmoved, alert, like the world had waited all night to let Marcus' rest days begin to form pattern. Atlas would eat only what Marcus offered by hand. Kibble remained untouched unless it was placed by Marcus, not just dumped in a bowl. When Marcus sat down to eat, Atlas would lie a few feet away but keep his eyes on him, never asking for food but always watching, like waiting for permission to be part of something again. Marcus started talking more, not to himself, not to the walls, but to Atlas. Little things at first. "Long day," he'd mutter, kicking off his shoes. "Think it's gonna rain tomorrow?" he'd ask, sipping coffee. Atlas never answered, of course, but his gaze always met Marcus's, steady and certain, like a witness who promised never to interrupt, but always to stay. When Marcus paced the living room during phone calls, Atlas tracked him with his eyes, ears flicking at the sound of rising stress. When Marcus played music, Atlas seemed to prefer the old soul records, Donny Hathaway, Bill Withers, Marvin Gaye. He never left the room during those. Just lay there, paws tucked under his chest, eyes half-lidded in a kind of distant, thoughtful stillness. One evening, Marcus sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, sipping bourbon still from a chipped glass. Atlas lay beside him, close but not touching. "You know," Marcus said quietly, staring at the far wall, "I used to hate the silence. After she left, it was the worst part. You don't realize how loud nothing can be until it's everywhere." Atlas turned his head slightly, his ears twitching at the word she. Marcus noticed. "Yeah, her. My ex, she hated dogs. Said they shed too much." He let out a short laugh that didn't quite reach the air. Turns out, the house was always empty, dog or not. Atlas didn't move, didn't judge, just stayed. Night after night, the same routine unfolded. Marcus would talk, Atlas would listen. Sometimes he'd sit beside Marcus at the foot of the couch, other times by the window. But every single night as Marcus walked toward his bedroom, Atlas followed and resumed his post right outside the door. Not asking to come in, just guarding. Like it was a mission. One morning, Marcus found Atlas already awake, sitting in the hallway facing the front door. Sunlight hit his fur in long bronze streaks. Marcus rubbed his eyes and asked, "What are you looking for out there?" But Atlas didn't turn. He just watched, still, unwavering, like he was waiting for something or someone that hadn't arrived yet. Something about that made Marcus's chest tighten. Not with fear, with familiarity. As if the dog wasn't watching for danger, but waiting for a memory to return. That day, Marcus found himself moving slower, more deliberate. He started leaving the front door open longer each morning so Atlas could sniff the air. He cleaned off the dog bed properly, added an old blanket he hadn't touched since before the divorce. Atlas settled on it like it was his from the beginning. In the quiet moments between laundry cycles, during late lunches while reading half-forgotten books, Marcus noticed something deeper. The silence in the house had changed texture. It wasn't brittle anymore. It breathed, because now it had someone else in it. And every time Marcus caught himself drifting back into old thoughts, the ones about who he used to be, who he failed to be, Atlas would glance up, just enough to ground him again. It wasn't about barking or fetching or tricks. It wasn't about companionship in the way people normally meant it. It was about presence. About being seen without needing to speak. Marcus didn't understand why the dog had ended up in that box. He didn't understand who sent him, or what he was here for. But he was starting to understand something else. That sometimes, healing didn't come from answers. Sometimes it came from being watched over while you slept. Sometimes it came from someone who refused to leave the doorway. It started with something as simple as cleaning. Marcus wasn't a neat freak, not by any stretch. But since Atlas had come into his life, the house felt like it deserved more attention. As if it had earned it. One quiet Thursday afternoon, while sunlight filtered through the blinds and an old Al Green record hummed in the background, Marcus found himself sitting on the floor next to Atlas, gently wiping down the dog's collar. The leather was worn but sturdy, its edges darkened by time and fur. He wasn't expecting to find anything, not really. It was just something to do with his hands, something to care for. But as he rotated the collar slowly in the light, he noticed something odd along the inside rim. Tiny scratches, not natural wear, but intentional markings spaced and oddly precise. He squinted, ran a finger over the grooves. They felt deliberate, almost coded. Curiously stirred something long dormant. Marcus reached for his phone, opened a search engine, and pulled up a Morse code translator. As he typed the short and long markings into the converter, a line of text emerged slowly, piece by piece. 37.1461 DEGW, and a name like Little Pine sounded more like a place than a person. He copied the numbers into a map app and watched as the screen zoomed in on a small town 2 hours south, tucked beside a cluster of forest roads and an old railroad track. There, nestled between outdated businesses and dusty lots, was a listing for a cafe, Little Pine Diner, St. 1964. He sat back, stared at Atlas. The dog didn't move, just blinked once slowly. "He was trying to take me somewhere?" Marcus asked under his breath. Atlas didn't bark. He never did. But he stood and walked to the door, sat beside it like he knew a journey had just been initiated. Later that evening, while searching through the hallway closet for his heavier jacket, Marcus grabbed the same coat he had worn the day he bought the box. He hadn't touched it since. Something in the lining felt off, a weight that shouldn't have been there. He turned the coat inside out and discovered a seam that had come slightly loose. He reached in. His fingers brushed something smooth. He tugged. Out came a photo folded once, the corners soft with age. He unfolded it carefully. The image was faded but clear enough. A man in his 70s or older. White hair, a heavy sweater, sitting in a wooden chair on a porch that looked vaguely familiar. Lying at his feet, head resting on one paw, was a young Atlas. Smaller but unmistakably him. His eyes were the same. Marcus's breath caught. He turned the photo over. On the back, written in a neat, slightly shaky hand were the words, "If he chose you, then you're invited to continue." There was no signature, no date, no explanation. Just that sentence full of quiet weight. Marcus sat on the floor, photo in one hand, collar in the other. Atlas nearby as always. Nothing felt coincidental anymore. The next morning he packed a small bag just in case and loaded Atlas into the passenger seat of his old sedan. He printed the directions, knowing full well the service would drop halfway down the highway. As they pulled out of the driveway, he caught himself glancing at the empty house in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something he was escaping. The drive to Little Pine was uneventful but serene. Fields rolled out in endless browns and golds, and the sky above was the kind of blue that felt borrowed from childhood. Atlas sat silently the whole way, head near the cracked window, nose twitching now and then as if reading the air for signs. Marcus didn't play music. The silence between them was full enough. They arrived in town just after noon. It was a blink and you miss it kind of place. One gas station, one church, and one diner with a hand-painted sign that simply read, Little Pine in chipped cream lettering. The building looked like it had been held together by memory and habit more than any recent maintenance. Marcus parked in front, stepped out slowly. Atlas followed without prompting, his movements purposeful, like his paws knew the way. Inside, the diner smelled like bacon grease and old coffee. A few locals sat scattered along the counter, murmuring over pie and sports sections. A woman behind the register looked up as they entered. Her gaze landed on Atlas and lingered. "Well, she whispered. "Ain't seen a shepherd like that in years." Marcus hesitated. "Did a man named Walter ever come through here?" he asked. The name had slipped out before he'd fully decided to say it. He wasn't even sure how he knew it, but it felt right. The woman's eyes softened. "Walter Hayes came in every other Sunday. Sat right by that window booth, always with his dog. Wouldn't say much, just sat, read, maybe drew a little. Quiet man." She nodded toward the far corner. Atlas was already walking toward it. Marcus followed him to the booth. It looked the same as everything else in the place, aged. Sturdy, still standing. Atlas sat beside the booth, facing outward, the same way he'd done in Marcus's hallway. Like guarding a place, not claiming it. Marcus slid into the seat. For a long time he said nothing, just watched the light spill in from the window, turning the tabletop into something warmer than laminate should be. The woman came over with a glass of water. "If you're a friend of Walter's, coffee's on the house," she said. He didn't correct her. He didn't know what to say. Under the edge of the table, his fingers brushed against something rough. Taped underneath was a small envelope. He pulled it free slowly, heart thudding. On the front, in the same handwriting as the photo, was a single word. "For the one who stayed." He opened it, hands trembling more than he'd like to admit. Inside was another photo. This one of Walter, older now, sitting on a bench near a lake. Sketchpad in lapless beside him, alert as ever. And a note. "We all need someone who chooses to stay. If Atlas chose you, then you have a story to finish that I couldn't." Marcus stared at the paper for a long time. He didn't understand the whole picture, but somehow he knew this wasn't just about a dog, or even about Walter. This was about something deeper, for something that had been waiting for someone like him. And now that it had begun to show itself, he couldn't stop. Not yet. The photo, the booth, the quiet message. Marcus left the diner feeling as though he'd stepped through a doorway that couldn't be closed again. Atlas walked beside him with that same steady gait, but there was something different now. A pull in his stride, like he was leading rather than following. The sun had begun to shift westward, stretching long shadows over the sidewalk, and the town itself seemed to exhale with the quiet of late afternoon. Marcus hadn't planned to stay long, but he found himself circling the block, letting Atlas guide his path. They passed a barber shop closed for the day, a hardware store with dusty windows, and then a small alley between two buildings that led to a gravel lot behind the diner. Atlas stopped, sniffed the air, then turned into the alley without hesitation. Marcus followed. At the far end of the lot was a small garden, overgrown but not wild. A chipped bench stood beneath a tree that had lost half its leaves. And to the left, tucked behind a faded door marked "Employees Only," was a second entrance to the diner's kitchen. Atlas stood there, tail still, body tense, ears forward. Marcus looked around, unsure, and knocked lightly. It wasn't long before the door opened. The man who stepped out was in his 70s, lean but sturdy, wearing a white apron smudged with flour and thyme. His hair was silver and thin, combed back in the way of men who'd kept the same style. His eyes landed on Marcus, briefly cautious, unreadable, but then dropped to Atlas. The change was immediate. His breath caught. He leaned forward. "Toby," he said, voice cracking on the second syllable. Then he shook his head, blinked hard, and corrected himself. "No, Atlas." Atlas didn't bark, didn't wait. He stepped forward, slow and certain, and rested his head gently against the old man's leg. The man dropped to one knee, placed a hand on Atlas's shoulder, and closed his eyes. "Damn," he whispered, "you're still here." Marcus stood silent, watching something pass between them that didn't need translation. After a long moment, the man rose to his feet, hands still resting on Atlas's back. "I thought he was gone for good," he said, glancing at Marcus. "Walter, I mean. And this guy, I never thought I'd see him again." "I'm Marcus," he said, extending a hand. The man shook it with a grip stronger than expected. "Raymond," he replied. "Ray, if you like. You came because of Walter, didn't you?" Marcus nodded. "He left some signs, clues maybe. And Atlas, I think he's showing me the way." Ray looked down at the dog. He always was good at that. Walter used to say he had a compass inside him. Not just for places, for people. They stepped inside, into the back of the diner, where the smells of butter, onions, and something sweet lingered in the air. The space was narrow, filled with aged pots, faded photos, and the hum of an old fridge. Ray pulled out 2 stools, gestured to the counter. "You hungry?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. "No, but I'd like to know more." About Walter, about Atlas. Ray nodded slowly, walked to a cupboard, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and returned. "Walter was a quiet man," he began, "but not silent. He just didn't waste words. Came in here almost every other Sunday for nearly 10 years. Sat in the same booth, ordered the same thing. Always brought Atlas. Except back then we called him Toby. That was the name Walter gave him." Marcus frowned slightly. "Why the change?" Ray sipped his tea. "Walter once told me Toby wasn't the name the dog chose. It was the name Walter needed. But if Toby ever left his side and found someone else, that person would know his real name. Seems like you did." Marcus looked down at Atlas lying at his feet, ears twitching with each word, but still calm. "I didn't name him. The collar did." Ray chuckled softly. "That sounds like Walter." Man had a flair for the cryptic. He believed some things, some connections weren't meant to be forced. Said if he ever couldn't be there anymore, Atlas would find his way. But only to someone who was ready. "Ready for what?" Marcus asked. Ray shook his head. "He never said. Just called it the next chapter. Told me once, real serious-like, that if Atlas ever came back without him, I'd know the story wasn't finished, that someone else had picked it up." There was silence for a moment. Then Ray stood, crossed to a dusty cabinet near the back, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were a few folded napkins, a pen, a small notepad, and a single Polaroid. He handed the photo to Marcus. It was Walter, sitting on a bench beneath a tree. Atlas, then younger, lay across his feet. Walter's face was peaceful in a way that spoke of someone who had found stillness after noise. Ray pointed to the bottom corner. Written in faint pencil were the words, "For the one he chooses." "I didn't know what it meant," Ray said, "but I kept it. Something told me it wasn't mine to throw away." Marcus stared at the photo, feeling something tighten in his chest. There was a thread here, one stretching backward through a life he'd never known, forward into something he hadn't yet become. Ray reached out, placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to understand it all. Just keep following him. He knows the way." Atlas rose then, slowly, and turned toward the door. Marcus looked down. "You ready to go?" he asked. The dog didn't move, just looked at him, then at the door, then back again. Ray smiled. "Looks like he's asking if you are." They drove home in a kind of silence that didn't feel heavy but expectant, like the hours just after a storm when the ground is still damp and the sky unsure of whether to break or brighten. Atlas rested his head against the window, eyes half closed, but Marcus noticed how his ears would perk slightly at every turn, like his body still tracked every direction, every scent, every intention. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what Ray had said, that Atlas didn't belong to anyone, that he chose, and more than that he had already chosen. That idea clung to Marcus as they rolled into his driveway, as he unpacked the small bag he never used, and as he sat on the edge of his bed long after midnight, turning the photo Ray had given him over and over in his hands. The following morning brought a strange burst of energy. Marcus found himself vacuuming the corners of rooms he hadn't entered in months, rearranging boxes in the hallway closet, sorting through stacks of papers and unopened mail like a man who'd suddenly remembered he was alive. Atlas followed him through the house quietly, tail swishing lightly, observing but never interrupting. The house itself seemed to respond, dust dancing in sunlight, floorboards creaking in familiarity, air shifting like breath returning to old lungs. In the back room, the one he used to call the office before it became a storage space for forgotten projects, Marcus pulled down a box of old books. The smell hit him instantly. Aged paper, dry glue, a faint trace of mildew. He opened a hardbound copy of Leaves of Grass that had belonged to his father. Inside the front cover, a postcard fluttered out and landed on the floor face down. Marcus reached for it, but before his hand closed over it, Atlas stepped forward and gently placed a paw beside it, as if to say, "Look closer." Marcus turned it over. It was a photograph, old, color-washed, the corners rounded from years tucked between pages. A group of children stood in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. In the middle, a younger Walter, unmistakable even in his 40s, smiled beneath a wide-brimmed hat. To his right stood a boy 7, maybe 8, grinning with a hand resting on the head of a German Shepherd puppy. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that smile, that awkward stance, that shirt. He remembered it, green with orange trim, from a summer camp he barely recalled attending. But he remembered the feeling of that fur under his hand, remembered laughing when the puppy licked his face. He hadn't known it was Atlas. He hadn't remembered Walter being there. But now the photo sat in his palm, and memory began to bloom like ink in water. He sat down hard on the floor. "How long have you known me?" he asked quietly, looking at Atlas. The dog blinked once. No wag, no bark, just stillness like acknowledgement. The phone rang. Marcus jumped. The screen lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He answered out of instinct. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a voice familiar gravelly. "This is Linda. From the sale." Marcus sat straighter. "Yes, hi." Her breath caught. "I didn't want to call, I wasn't going to, but I need to say something." Marcus stayed silent. "I put that box out because I thought it was empty," she said. "I thought it was just junk my uncle never threw away. But when you left with it, I got spooked. Something about the way you looked at it, like you were supposed to find it." Marcus glanced at the photo in his hand. Linda continued, voice trembling now. "I came back that night and..." Marcus's breath slowed. "But the next morning," she said, "it was back, sitting right where you found it. Same dust, same tape, same everything. Like it had never left, and I swear to you I didn't put it there." Marcus closed his eyes. Linda's voice cracked. I think it wasn't done yet." He didn't respond, he couldn't. Atlas sat nearby, watching him, still, present, unblinking. Linda sniffled. "I don't know what this means, but I think you were meant to open that box. Not me, not anyone else." Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Thank you for calling," he said. When the call ended, he placed the phone down gently. Atlas approached and sat beside him, close enough that their arms touched. The weight of everything settled in, not heavy, not overwhelming, but deep, like soil over roots. There were connections here he hadn't asked for, memories that had waited for decades to surface, and a story that somehow had always included him, even when he'd forgotten the beginning. Atlas leaned his head gently onto Marcus's shoulder, and outside, the sky began to darken, not with storm, but with the kind of dusk that promised another step was coming. After the call from Linda, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him had already been set into motion long before he stepped into that garage sale. That the box, the dog, the photos, The memories, they hadn't been random pieces falling into place, but puzzle pieces waiting for him to notice they'd always belonged together. He spent most of that day moving slowly, quietly, like the air inside the house had thickened with something invisible but meaningful. Atlas followed him room to room as always, never demanding, never loud, just present, always present. The sun fell early that evening, veiled behind a stretch of low-hanging clouds, and by dinner time rain began to fall. Not a storm, but a steady, rhythmic curtain of water that wrapped the house in a kind of gentle hush. Marcus made tea, turned on a small lamp by the window, and sat cross-legged on the rug near where Atlas had claimed his usual spot. The floor beneath them had always creaked a little, an old house's way of remembering every step ever taken. But tonight there was something different in the sound, a kind of echo that didn't quite fit. As Marcus shifted to adjust the lamp cord, his hand brushed a faint seam between two planks, subtle but uneven. He pressed down lightly. It gave. He paused, looked at Atlas, who simply blinked and rested his head on his paws. Marcus stood and fetched a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Kneeling, he wedged the tool into the seam and pried. The plank lifted with a soft groan, revealing a narrow space beneath. Inside was a folded piece of paper, browned with time. The edges curled inward like it had been holding its breath for years. He picked it up carefully, unfolded it with both hands. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone whose hands no longer listened to his will, but it was legible. A single line stretched across the center of the page. Not every loss is an ending. Marcus sat back on his heels. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, though he wasn't sure if it was from the draft under the floor or something inside himself. He looked at Atlas, who had lifted his head now, eyes locked onto his, but he didn't need to. Later that night, as the rain intensified, Marcus drifted into a light sleep on the couch. A clap of thunder startled him awake sometime past midnight, and when he opened his eyes, Atlas was standing by the back door, tail still, body tense, as if listening to something Marcus couldn't hear. He stood, rubbed his eyes, and watched as Atlas pawed at the door, once delicate but deliberate. "You want to go out?" Marcus asked. Atlas looked back at him, blinked once. Marcus grabbed his coat, slipped on his boots, and opened the door. Cold rain misted his face immediately, and the ground was slick with wet leaves and old mud. But Atlas didn't hesitate. He moved down the porch steps and across the yard, paused silent on the earth, stopping only when he reached the base of the old maple tree near the fence line. Marcus followed closely, heart racing for reasons he couldn't name. Atlas sniffed at a patch of ground near the trunk, then sat, waiting. Marcus knelt, brushing aside wet leaves. His hands touched something hard metal. He dug carefully, fingers slipping in the mud until he unearthed a small rusted tin box. It was sealed with a strip of worn fabric tied in a clumsy knot. He looked at Atlas. "This yours?" he whispered. Atlas didn't move. Marcus untied the knot and opened the lid. Inside were photographs curled from moisture but still intact. Letters, 2 folded slips of paper, some yellowed, some gray, ink smudged from tears or time. The top photo showed Walter sitting at the same tree, younger but tired-looking, staring off into the distance with a haunted gaze. The first letter was addressed simply, "To my son." Marcus didn't breathe for a moment. His eyes scanned the page, recognizing the handwriting from the message beneath the floor. He read slowly. "Never knew how to say it in person. I was too proud, too ashamed, but I thought of you every day. Every time Atlas looked at me like he could see through the lie of who I was pretending to be, I saw you. I saw the boy I left behind. I kept these letters because I wasn't sure I'd ever find the right way to send them. But maybe someone else will. Maybe the dog will know who's worthy of holding what I couldn't carry anymore." The letter ended with no name, no date. Just space, as if Walter had run out of words or time. Marcus read every letter in the box. Some were apologies so raw they shook him. Others were quiet observations, memories jotted down in desperate attempts to hold onto someone long gone. Many included Atlas described as a witness, a companion, a reminder that even when a man fails the people he loves, there can still be loyalty left to tend the ruins. When Marcus looked up from the final letter, the rain had softened. Atlas was still beside him, fur damp but eyes dry, waiting. Marcus closed the tin, cradled it in his arms like something sacred. You carried all of this, he murmured. You kept it safe. Atlas leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against Marcus's knee. The wind stirred through the trees, and from somewhere inside the dark, Marcus thought he heard something shift, not outside but within. A breaking open, not a breaking down. The morning after the rain, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the tin box open beside him. The letters unfolded like the pages of a life he had only just started to read. The house was quieter than usual, not because it lacked sound, but because it felt like something inside it had finally settled. Like the walls had exhaled after holding their breath for too long. Atlas lay nearby, half asleep, tail thumping gently every few minutes like a metronome marking a song only he could hear. Marcus looked at the stack of letters again, each one heavy with regret, honesty, and something else. Something that reminded him of unfinished prayers whispered into old wood. He had intended to put them away, store them in the hallway closet or under his bed, but instead he found himself moving them onto the living room shelf, right next to a collection of books he hadn't opened since the divorce. Over the next few days, Marcus noticed a pattern in Atlas's behavior. Something subtle, almost ritualistic. Every afternoon, right around 2 o'clock, Atlas would move to the front living room, sit by the large window and remain there unmoving for at least 15 minutes. Sometimes longer. It wasn't like the usual lounging spots Atlas had taken over. This was different. Intentional. Marcus began to pay closer attention. He started timing it. Always the same window. Always the same hour. Always the same stillness. On the 5th day, Marcus sat across from him, quietly watching. Sunlight poured in through the pane, casting a long rectangle of gold across the wooden floor. Atlas's fur shimmered in it, the black and brown blending like paint underwater. Marcus followed the line of the light with his eyes, until he noticed something etched faintly into the bottom edge of the window frame. He leaned in. The words were small, nearly worn away by time or cleaning, but still visible if you knew to look. This is where he used to write. Marcus ran his finger across the letters, breath catching in his throat. Walter, he whispered. You sat here. He looked at Atlas, whose gaze remained fixed outward as if remembering, or waiting. Later that evening, while sorting through a dusty stack of books on the hallway bookshelf, ones he'd never bothered to unpack since moving in, Marcus found a manila envelope wedged between 2 hardcovers. It was unlabeled, thick with photos. He pulled it out, peeled back the flap and poured the contents onto the table. Dozens of photographs spilled out, some faded, others in clearer condition. Many were of the house, the front porch, the backyard, the living room with furniture he didn't recognize. And then, one photo stopped him. It was a wide shot of the porch, captured during what looked like late summer. Walter sat in a chair on the left side, one leg crossed over the other, a mug in hand. Atlas, younger alert, lay at his feet. But in the bottom right corner, barely in the frame, was a boy, maybe 7 or 8, holding a popsicle, wearing a green and orange camp shirt, laughing mid-sentence at someone outside the frame. Marcus's hands shook. He stared at the boy's face. The teeth, the hair, the posture. It was him. He didn't remember the photo being taken, didn't remember being on that porch, but the proof was there in his hands. He had been in that house before, not just recently, years ago, long before the box, long before Atlas returned. His mind searched for context. His mother had mentioned visiting a friend of a friend one summer when Marcus was little, staying in a borrowed house while someone else was traveling. Could that have been it? Had he spent time in this very place without realizing it would one day become his home? He looked at Atlas. The dog didn't move, just watched him, calm, patient. You knew, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. You knew me back then. Atlas blinked once. Marcus sat down hard in the kitchen chair. The threads were connecting in ways he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a story he had stumbled into. It was a story he had left and returned to, without even knowing it. The thought was dizzying but comforting too, like the pieces of himself that had always felt unrooted were finally finding soil. He returned to the window the next afternoon and sat in Walter's spot. The light came in strong, warm. He brought a notebook and a pen, not planning to write anything specific, but just to feel what Walter might have felt. He scribbled a few lines, not poetry, not letter, just fragments. The dog knows, the house remembers. Maybe we don't find home. Maybe home finds us. Atlas lay beside him, exactly where he always did. The sun crept across the floor slowly, touching everything with the softness of old memory. The porch light flickered once, though no one had turned it on. Marcus stood, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. The evening was cool, the scent of lilacs rising from the edge of the yard. He glanced back at the porch railings, tracing the wood with his eyes, looking for something, though he didn't know what. And then he saw it. Another photo, tucked under the edge of a loose board. He pulled it free. It was Walter again, this time with Atlas curled on the porch step beside him. The angle was different, taken from the yard, likely by someone standing where Marcus now stood. On the back, in familiar handwriting, were 5 words. He always returns to here. Marcus sat on the porch step, photo in hand, the sun dipping low behind the trees. Atlas came to sit beside him, and inside the house a breeze stirred through the open window, as if someone had exhaled. A week after finding the photograph on the porch, Marcus began noticing the shift in Atlas's movements. It was subtle at first, a slower rise from sleep, a pause before taking the stairs, a longer stretch before settling at his usual window spot. He wasn't weak, not visibly, but he moved like someone carrying weight no one else could see. Marcus didn't mention it aloud, not even to himself, and waited until a flyer pinned on the bulletin board at the corner cafe caught his eye. A local photography exhibit, curated by the town's Heritage Society, featuring rarely seen moments from the last 50 years of life in Little Pine. It was titled, "What Remains?" Marcus didn't intend to go at first, but something about the name, about the weight of those 2 words, stuck in his chest. So on a quiet Saturday morning, with the air still cool and the sun bright but gentle, he and Atlas walked the 4 blocks to the community center. The building was simple, weathered, with high windows and walls lined in white panels that made the photos look like memories hanging in a dream. At first, the images felt distant. Children playing near the creek, families posing at the old train station, black and white snapshots of soldiers waving from parade floats. But then Marcus turned a corner, and Atlas stopped walking. Completely frozen. The photo in front of them was large, mounted on foam board. Walter sat on a wooden bench near the lake, sketchpad balanced on his lap. Atlas lay curled beneath him, young but alert, his head tilted up toward something just beyond the frame. And behind them, barely in focus, caught in a reflection off the lake's surface, was a figure. Faint, small, but real. A boy. Marcus stepped closer. The shirt was striped, the face turned in profile, the posture unmistakable. It was him, he knew it, even though he had no memory of standing there, even though no part of his mind could recall that afternoon by the lake. But Atlas remembered. The dog stood motionless, eyes fixed on the image, tail low but still as if greeting a ghost. Marcus crouched slowly beside him, placed a hand on his back. "You remember this?" he whispered. Atlas didn't blink. A woman nearby, wearing a volunteer badge and sorting name tags, looked over. "That one's always been my favorite," she said. "The artist Walter Hayes used to come to every town event, drew everything. That dog was with him always. He had this way of sitting still, like he was guarding the moment." Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. The volunteer continued. "Funny thing is, no one ever figured out who the kid in the background was. It was like he was never really part of the photo, just passing through." Marcus swallowed hard. That evening, back at the house, Atlas lay curled on the rug near the fireplace. Marcus sat beside him, running his fingers through the fur along his back, slower than usual, more deliberate. He didn't want to ask what he already feared, but he needed to know. So the next morning, he made an appointment with the vet. The clinic was quiet, tucked beside a hardware store on the edge of town. Dr. Keller, the same woman who had first examined Atlas when Marcus found him, greeted them at the door. She smiled gently, kneeling to stroke Atlas behind the ears. "Still the quiet one," she murmured. Inside the exam room, she worked with practiced calm, listening, checking, observing. Marcus sat in the chair near the corner, hands clasped, leg bound. When she finished, she turned and sat beside him. Her voice was soft but certain. "He's not sick," she said, "at least not in the way you'd expect. No tumors, no major organ failure. His joints are slowing, yes, and there's fatigue in his system, but he's not in pain. Marcus exhaled, half in relief, half in confusion. Then why does he feel? His dogs are more than pets, Marcus. You know that. Dogs like Atlas don't just live in homes. They live in people. And sometimes when their job is done, they start to let go, quietly, gently. It's not about disease. It's about completion. Marcus felt his throat tighten. So what do I do? She placed a hand on his. You let him know it's okay to stay. If he's waiting for permission to go, or permission to keep going, he needs to hear it from you. Back at the house, the day unfolded slowly. Atlas didn't move much, but when Marcus sat by the front window, he came and settled beside him, resting his head against Marcus's shin. The light came in warm for Selivek, slower than usual. The floor creaked faintly beneath them. Marcus reached down, cupped Atlas's face in both hands, and leaned forward until their foreheads touched. His voice was steady but full. I still need you, he whispered. I'm not done, so if you're still able, stay, please. Atlas didn't move, didn't blink, but he exhaled through his nose, slow and soft, and leaned just a little closer. And from somewhere behind the silence, Marcus swore he felt the house lean with them. The morning unfolded quietly, as if the world had forgotten to wind itself up. Marcus stirred beneath the blankets, the room awash in a soft golden light that bled through the sheer curtains. For a moment there was nothing unusual. No distant car horns, no creaking floorboards, no tapping of paws against tile. Just he blinked slowly, stretching one arm toward the edge of the bed where, for weeks now, Atlas had rested each morning like clockwork, breathing steady, always within reach. But there was no warmth there today. No soft exhale, only silence, more complete than usual. A silence that hummed with absence. Marcus sat up slowly, his body hesitant in a way his mind hadn't yet caught up with. The living room was bathed in morning light, that familiar rectangular patch of sun falling across the floor, just as it had every day since Atlas claimed it. And in the center of it, lying with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something distant, was Atlas. His body stretched long, peaceful, his paws relaxed, his eyes closed. It simply rested there, heavy and inevitable. He stepped forward slowly, sank to his knees beside Atlas, reached out a trembling hand to place it against his side. No rise, no fall, no heartbeat beneath the fur, just warmth slowly fading. He pressed his forehead to Atlas's, breath caught between his ribs, and whispered nothing at all because words couldn't live in that kind of silence. Only love that didn't need language. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Time blurred at the edges, reshaped by grief that didn't sob, didn't wail but hung in the air like smoke after fire, lingering, acrid, sacred. Marcus found the old quilt from the box, the one Atlas had arrived in, and wrapped him gently inside. He moved slowly, reverently, each motion a ritual, each fold a prayer. The backyard was soft from recent rain, the earth damp but yielding beneath the shovel. Beneath the lilac bush, Atlas's favorite spot in spring, where he'd watch butterflies drift lazily through the sunlight. Marcus dug until the soil gave way, dark and deep. He lowered the wrapped body into the ground, his hands muddied, his breath sharp in the chill morning air. Beside the quilt, he placed a small bundle, the collar carefully cleaned and fastened, a single photo from the tin box, the one with Walter sketching on the bench, Atlas at his feet, and Marcus in the background. Caught by fate more than camera, he placed it gently at Atlas's side, not as tribute, as memory. When he finished covering the grave, he sat back on his heels and wiped the dirt from his palms. He stayed there a long time, no eulogy, no final words, just his presence and the wind. Later he found a flat stone near the creek behind the property, smooth and broad. He carried it back and etched the words with a borrowed chisel, each letter slow and deliberate, as if cutting them gave shape to his sorrow. He didn't come to but he stayed forever. He placed the stone at the head of the grave, stood back, breathed. The house felt different when he stepped back inside. Not emptier, just changed. Like it had absorbed the shape Atlas had left behind, folded it into its walls, its breath. The sunlight still came in at 2 o'clock. The porch still creaked in the evenings. The notebook still sat open on the table. Marcus picked it up, turned to a new page, and wrote without pausing. Some souls don't say goodbye. They simply become part of the quiet. And the quiet agreed. The days that followed were quiet in a way Marcus had never experienced before. Not the hollow quiet of grief, nor the numbing kind that follows loss, but something steadier, more grounded, like the house had finally found its own heartbeat. The routines remained. Morning coffee brewed automatically at 7, not because he couldn't let go, but because letting go wasn't the point. Remembering was. The map Walter had drawn still hung on the wall, its red circles and penciled notations gently curling at the corners. And next to it, Marcus had tacked up the flat stone rubbing he had made of the gravestone under the lilac. Some mornings he'd sit by the window, reading old letters or scribbling down new ones to no one in particular. Sometimes he just sat in silence, watching the wind tug at the curtain, thinking of Atlas the way one thinks of a story that never stops telling itself. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that it happened. The day was soft with early spring, the kind that carries warmth without the weight of summer. Marcus was returning from the garden, fingers streaked with earth from pruning the lilac near Atlas's grave, when he saw a small figure at the gate. A young girl, maybe 10 or 11, with her hair pulled into 2 tight braids and a backpack slung crooked across one shoulder. She was crouched beside the mailbox, studying something inside it. As Marcus approached, he saw what she was looking at, an old notebook, the same one he'd used for months now, left intentionally in the box as he often did lately, not for any real reason except that it felt right, like maybe someone might find it the way he had found the letters, the photos, the dog. "You can open it," Marcus said gently, his voice more gravel than usual after a quiet morning. The girl looked up, startled at first, but her gaze softened when she met his. He gestured toward the house, stepping back to let the gate creak open. "Come in, I'll show you." She followed him up the porch steps with quiet feet, careful like someone entering a museum. Inside, the living room was bathed in warm light, and Marcus guided her to the window seat, the one that still caught the light at just the right angle every afternoon. She sat, eyes wide, notebook in her lap, fingers resting on the cover like it might open by itself. Marcus sank into the old chair across from her, the one that had become his favorite since Atlas passed, and let the silence stretch between them a moment before speaking. "This used to be his spot," he said, nodding toward the floor. "Every day he'd lie right there like he was waiting for something or maybe guarding up." "Who was he?" Marcus leaned back, eyes. "His name was Atlas. He wasn't just a dog. He was a keeper of memories, of second chances, of people who didn't know they needed to be found." The girl tilted her head. "Like a guardian?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Exactly like that." She flipped open the notebook, reading a few lines in silence. "Did you write all of this?" "Some," Marcus answered. "Others came from before me, people I never met but somehow knew me anyway." Her eyes flicked to the wall where the map hung. "Is that where you've been?" He chuckled softly. "Some of it, yes. Every place on that map holds something someone left behind. A note, a photo, a moment worth remembering." The girl turned back to the notebook, and her finger paused under one sentence on the first page. She looked at him again. "It says, 'For the next soul who needs to find something.'" Marcus nodded. "That's you, if you want it to be." She closed the notebook slowly, as if sealing a secret. "Okay," she whispered. He smiled, not wide but deep. "Then let's start from here." He reached for the notebook gently, opened to the next blank page, and with careful strokes wrote a final line. "You came in a box, but you left behind a world." As he set the pen down, the sunlight shifted through the window, landing exactly on the empty space where Atlas used to lie. It wasn't coincidence. It never had been. It was a reminder that some lives don't end. They ripple. Some stories don't conclude, they pass on. And some guardians never leave. They simply wait to be found again. If this story moved you even a little, consider subscribing to stay connected for more stories like this crafted from silence, memory, and meaning. What moment in the story stayed with you the longest? And by the way, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know who's sharing this journey and what part of Atlas's story spoke to you.